We're going to move on and we're going to talk about one of my favorite features in Google Apps, and that is the calendar service. Let me just get out of this over here. Okay. And we'll talk about the calendar services. Okay. So one of the things that I love about Google Apps is that once you've added your users, the calendar service is available to everybody, which is really awesome. Okay? So even before you start going through, data migration and whatnot, once you add your users, they can start using email. And if you've enabled the calendar service, they can also use the calendar service. Okay? And there's some great functionality in this as well. So you can have it allows the use of one of the big features within the Premier Edition, or the For Business Edition, as well as Education, if I'm not mistaken, is that you can also add resources to your calendar. So for example, in most companies, they have conference rooms, maybe they have equipment. One of the partners we had in the class, I thought it was really interesting, specialized in construction industry. And what they used calendar resources were for some of their big pieces of equipment. The bulldozer, the crane. So that workers were able to actually, were actually able to set up time to basically use those pieces of equipment, and it was not available to anyone else. Okay. So within the calendar, you can also have resources, and you can also share your calendar inside and outside of your domain. Okay? Which is the whole idea of Google Apps, is making things accessible. Resources or information accessible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through a couple of things here. I'm going to log in as my administrator. Okay. And just show you the calendar resource, the calendar service. Okay. So you do have the ability to create a shortcut for your calendar. Also define how much sharing is going to be done with your calendar. And also what the default is. So when someone actually adds a calendar, how much information is shared by default. You also have the ability to disable the calendar service. For example, this is what I want to point out, and that is resources. Okay. Now, it may not be intuitive, but as the administrator within the control panel, you as the administrator can add the resources. And the idea is if I log in as one of my end users, do we see my number 4 domain there? I usually use another account, so.
Using like a site start page or something.
Yeah. I do, but I have that set up for my old, there we go. So if I log in as Fred Fields, I'm showing you the end result here. Oh, Fred Fields is in my my subdomain. Give me 1 second. I got too excited too quickly, so bear with me. Let me just remember my password. Okay. We'll come back to this in a second. Very good. And if I go to my calendar, and I go ahead and try to create an event, we'll see the resources here as well. Okay, so not only can I add a person Okay, so I want to set up an appointment with Fred Fields. I also want to go ahead and use this particular resource. Do you notice by default it only shows me the resources that are available, okay, at that particular time? It won't make a difference in this scenario, but you could also have it list all of your resources. And also, if I type MTV, it only shows me those resources that start with those particular characters.
Can a person
So-
be a resource?
What?
Can a person be a resource?
A person
Like,
will.
you need somebody like a sales engineer or something. It's really a resource.
Yeah, let's hold off on that, but probably the answer is yes. Okay, but then you have to. We'll see how that works in a moment. So let's step back on that. Okay, but isn't that pretty cool? So I'm setting up a meeting with another user that's in a subsidiary, and then I'm also setting up a conference room. Okay. If I go ahead and try to set up a meeting at this particular time, this particular resource will show that it's not available. Oop. I'm sure it's,
Too short a
yeah.
no.
There we go. So now I'll go ahead and save that. It'll send a notification to that user.
Do, just a little question.
Yes.
Do conference rooms or do resources could they have an associated email address with them or not?
So let's talk about how this works. Okay, so let's go back into the administration console. I just wanted to show you really quickly how it works for the user. So if I go to the calendar, and now once again, as the administrator, you have to set these resources up, or you can use the calendar APIs. There are APIs that allow you to do this as well. So how does this really work? And how does this all relate to calendar? So the actuality is that each of these resources within our data centers, within the back-end systems, they are really calendars. And what happens, let's go to one of these resources I've already created, what does it have associated with it? An email address. So that's what Google Apps uses, or what Google uses in the back end to sort of, set up an appointment with a resource, is it's really using email to communicate with that particular resource. Okay? So I do want to point that out. I find that really, really interesting. So actually, each of these calendars, just like they're a person, has an email address and can have a calendar. Resources really have a calendar associated with them, and they have an email address. Isn't that pretty cool?
Now, is there an inbox associated with it?
So no, it's not a real thing.
The reason I'm asking is, like, for example, say there is a particular executive assistant. I could use the secretary. If you use the word, like, if the secretary managed a particular conference room and she wanted to, and so she invited, the conference room is used, she looks at her calendar in the morning and says, this conference room booked, I have to clean it.
We'll talk about that scenario in a moment. Because it has an email, because it has a calendar associated with it, we'll expand on that. But let me come to that point, okay? Because you can also, I thought you were going with this, is sometimes you have a resource that you want people to be able to see, but you don't want them to actually schedule time with it directly, like an executive suite, or maybe a training room. So you can actually delegate ownership of that resource as a calendar that your executive assistant can now manage that particular room. Yes. Okay, we'll show you how to do that, but we want to build it. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to add a resource. Okay. In some cases, people like to make resources visible within their calendar before setting up the appointment. I may want to maybe I have a favorite conference room that I like to use, and I want to add that resource calendar to my calendar, and then know when I have available time. And then we'll also talk about delegating authority for a resource. Basically, my executive assistant can manage a particular executive conference room. So you'll do this in the exercise, and this is one of the things I really love about apps.
Is there a way to, other than just by naming convention, a way to organize them for in a large organization, there might be a few hundred conference rooms.
Sure. The naming convention is really important. That is the essential method of organizing it so that it lists appropriately. I know that in the API documentation for Calendar, there's actually a nice article there. If I can find it, I'll get it for you, that talks about the naming convention. But it is the naming convention that's really essential because it will list in this order. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and, yeah?
Is there any licensing restrictions or impacts? How many resources?
I don't know what the absolute resource limit is, but when you create a new resource, there's a 100-character limit for a resource name.
But, if you create 50, it doesn't affect your license?
No, it's not taking up a real user. Okay, so you can have an unlimited, I don't know what the actual limit is, of calendars and resources that are available. If there's an absolute, I'll have to research if there's an absolute limit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create another resource. I'm going to try to stick with my naming convention here. So it's MTV-VC. I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource. So one of the naming conventions is to come up with a location. So you want to come up with a consistent naming convention, especially in larger organizations. So one of the recommendations is location, maybe the type of resource, and then maybe the actual location. And in this case, we use this a lot at Google, is the capacity of that resource. Okay, so in Mountain View, my video conference room is in location 1000 and it holds 25 users. So you want to come up with some kind of naming convention. Let me go through the mechanics. And then this is going to be 1501 Sal. That's where we are. And then let's say the capacity here is 50. And then the resource type, this is just really used for your purposes. I think it's also available to the API. And I'm just going to not put in a description. So I'm going to go ahead and create that resource. Okay. There it is. And if I click on it after I've created it, you'll see there's an email address that is now associated with it. Okay. Does everyone see that? Okay. Very good. And let's see. I'm sort of playing a little bit here. Let me go ahead and I'm going to create an event and let's see what resources are available to me. It hasn't appeared yet. It does take a couple of minutes until that appears. Okay. Everybody with me? Okay. Now let's talk a little bit more. So we have a resource which is managed through a calendar that has an email address associated with it that allows users to schedule time with that particular resource. The owner of this resource, which is really what? A calendar, is who? The administrator. The administrators own all of these calendar resources. So let's look at, I'm going to now go into Calendar as the administrator. Okay. And I want you to notice that the administrator has all of the calendars there except not the one that I just created. Do you see that? It'll take a couple of minutes until the calendar will actually appear there for that particular resource, but I'm getting a little impatient because we're getting closer and closer to 5 o'clock. So if I want to see that quickly in my calendar as the administrator, if I waited, it would come up eventually. But if I hit return, it now appears in the administrator's calendar. Okay. Do not demo calendar as an administrator. You go to a customer site and you have 1,000 resources, do not show them your administrator calendar unless you're demoing calendar. So another best practice when you're doing demos. Do not do demos as the administrator. It's not a good idea. Okay? So the administrator currently owns this particular calendar resource that I just created. Normally, if I waited long enough, it would automatically appear in their calendar. I got impatient, so I copied and pasted the email address of that resource in my admin calendar. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Okay. Because if you're doing something else, you missed it. Okay. So now I can go ahead and I can manage the settings of that calendar as the administrator. Okay. And if I wish to, I can decide how much sharing of this calendar, of this resource that I want to make available. Okay, so I wanted to build before we got to some of those other questions. Okay, so by default, this calendar or this resource that's managed through a calendar is available to everybody. What if I want to delegate authority to this calendar resource to another user and I want them to own this calendar? Okay. What I can do is I can enter a person's name here. Okay, so it could be Fred Fields. It could be one of my other users. Maybe it's going to be B. Schmel. And then I can now allow them to make changes and manage the sharing. Okay. And what I can do is I can now say maybe no one else in our domain is it really shared with them. If they want to actually set up time, schedule time with this particular resource, it has to be done through maybe B. Schmel, who's our executive assistant. Okay? So this calendar resource behaves like any other calendar. Does that make sense? Okay. If you know a little bit about calendars, users can actually create multiple calendars as well and share that secondary calendar with other users as well. Maybe, for example, that's how we manage our I manage our training schedule. Is I actually have a calendar that I make available, for example, at the Postini training site, and I manage the calendar myself, and it becomes publicly accessible, for example. That's how we do it for Google Apps seminars. But that's a calendar that many people share. We add webinars to that schedule, to that calendar, and it's shared with everyone else. The concept is the same here. But in this case, what is it? It's a resource that's really what? A calendar that has an email address associated with it. Isn't that brilliant? Okay? So if you got all the pieces, you can understand how a resource can be shared and how people can schedule time with a particular resource, because it's no different than anyone else's calendar. Yes, Peter?
A resource is linked to an admin, but what if you have multiple admins?
Well, all the administrators will have ownership of that, and try that out. So it's not really owned by me, the person, the admin that created it. Anyone that has admin privileges will have that. Yeah?
So if the share of this calendar with others is checked, and you have these other settings with specific people, those all are in effect at the same time?
Yes, they're all in effect at the same time. So I won't be able to actually delegate as an end user. I will not actually be able to schedule time with this resource. Okay? I would have to go through the owner. Only the owner of that calendar can do that. Okay?
So the second section there, where it's relevant, overrides the first. So in the first section there,
I have to say, because where my brain is right now, let's try it out. We start getting to the what if scenarios, we just have to try it out and try the combinations. Is that okay?
yeah.
Okay, very good. So anyway, I wanted you to see that. Okay. So let's go back and hit save. So this is the administrator. Now, it's also sometimes the end user's desire to have a resource appear on their calendar. Like I said, for example, there's a particular conference room I like to do. I do training in London, and what I want to do is I just want to be able to see on my calendar that calendar for that resource so I can decide when to schedule something. So there's two ways to get to a resource. You go inside your calendar and see, okay, what time is available, or you can come through the other way is you go to the resource, see what time's available, and schedule time with that. So it allows you to work both ways. Okay? So by default, typically all these resources do not appear in end users' calendars. So what I want to spend a few minutes with is talking about how I can make those resources appear in my end users' calendars. Okay. So I'm going to log back in as this user. See how nice it is when you, oh, it isn't that nice, is it? It's remembering my my personal email account with Google. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Calendar, and remember the newest resource I added is 1501. There it is. Oh, that's because I logged in as bschmel and I delegated authority to that particular user. So it's already was a bad example. Okay, so what I want to show you here is the ability to add. There we go. You can add other calendars or interesting calendars to your calendar as well. So you can browse interesting calendars. And if I go on more, so there's all these different built-in calendars to Google Apps you can add as well. I can go to Resources for Google Apps, okay? And what I can do here is I can pick and choose which of these resources I want to see appear in my calendar.
So this is a pretty common question, and I think more it's because people don't know how to use the tool effectively. People are saying, I want to see what the schedule is for room A. But I think the more important question is, I want to find a room that can hold 5 people that is video conferencing equipment. I don't care where that room is. And so that's one of the things I found is people really want to see this, but it's less important than actually going in and actually what Barry showed you. The first thing is that, and just the way Barry's showing you, first show them how to actually book a room and illustrated the fact that we're only seeing rooms that are available, and the filtering, that's mission critical. But the users typically want to see what just Barry's just showing you here. So just be aware of when you're coaching your pilot group, that's where the discussion goes.
Okay, that's very, very good. Okay, so the idea is that you can book a resource and do it that way. But there are some people, for example, that like to see a particular resource calendar, and so you will get this question as Salim mentioned that. Okay, so the way you actually can get these other calendars to also appear is by adding them. And these are considered interesting calendars, and they're go under more resources. So all the resources that I've created for my domain will actually appear here. Okay, so if I wish, for example, let me go back a sec. There we go. Is the one for Paris. Maybe I want to subscribe to that particular resource so that the Paris training room will also appear inside my calendar. Okay? So what I keep coming back to is the calendar resources behave like any other calendar because, for example, I may be interested in seeing US holidays. I want to show this in my calendar as well. There aren't any interesting holidays right now, but if I go to this week, you'll see Labor Day. So if you understand calendars, which is really important, then you'll understand resources. Okay? So it depends where you're coming from. So hopefully you better understand calendars because we talked about resources, but if you understand calendars, you now really understand what resources are. So a resource is really just a calendar that you schedule time with. They're managed in the background through this email address, okay? And through the magic of that email address, it really what allows you to actually have that calendar resource made available within your own calendar.
I have a general question about calendars. Google Apps, maybe people in the room have experience with this. Maybe this isn't the time for it. In both Exchange and Domino and many other systems I've worked with, people when they use Gmail at home or other products at home find that the calendar works perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But then they get to work and they're in a situation where rather than just creating an appointment for themselves, they're creating a repeating appointment that includes 30 other people, and anytime it occurs on a Monday, they need to reschedule it, and on this particular day, it needs to have this room booked, and on these days, they need to add these people. So much, much more complicated scenarios. And on most other platforms I've worked on, there's problems there. And people get really frustrated, and they say this platform sucks. How does the Google Calendar stack up there in real complicated calendaring scenarios?
So I'm not sure how to answer that. I know that I know what some of the issues are when you have repetitive events and you're trying to schedule a resource and it's not available. Let's say you want to schedule a repeating meeting on Monday.
You want to schedule something out?
Every single Monday, yeah. And you schedule a particular resource for every single Monday, but it's not available one Monday. It will not actually set up that event. So you need to know that. So that's one thing I know it doesn't do the way you would want it to do. But a lot of services don't do that as well.
Everyone has problems.
Yeah.
In a variety of different ways.
So I'm not sure, and I'll let Salim if you want to add something in terms of repetitive events with multiple users, if you try to schedule time with them. And some are, I know with people, it'll let you schedule time even though they're not available. But I know with the resources, it'll only let you schedule that event for that entire duration if the resource is available the entire duration.
Often problems come up even more as the meeting lives on for a while.
Yeah.
So you've created a repeat meeting that goes on for a year, and you're adding people, removing people, rescheduling dates. Does anyone have experience with that on the platform?
So I've had good success if I have a repetitive, for example, you have a staff meeting and you want to schedule it with everybody. You can go into, so me as one of the members of the staff, you know, by default I can have it accept everything, and then for an individual one, I can manage that separately. So I think in terms of scheduling time with other people, it behaves really, really nicely. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm more talking about the complexity. Like if you ask me
Yeah.
about Exchange or Notes, I'd say, yeah, it works great. But if you ask an executive's administrative assistant who's managing 3 people's
Calendar, yeah.
The calendar is literally back-to-back, half-hour meetings, and stuff is changing constantly. They have a very different view.
Okay.
Thoughts?
Yeah, the delegation is fine. I think that the room is just very simple.
Yeah.
I think delegation, moving meetings around and finding available free time, I think that's generally okay. And you know, on the device, you could actually easily view multiple calendars through the device.
So one of the things with the executive's calendar, so that's I've had the same experience. So I've one of the great things about being at Google, especially the enterprise team, is when we go live with a customer, if we're available, we can actually go to the customer go live site. So I've been to a couple of these. So especially in the Bay Area. So we had a customer a couple of months ago, a larger customer that went live in the Bay Area. And so I was, you know, we had this room set up. So if anybody had any questions, they could come in. We always have one person delegated for the executive assistants, okay? Because number one, they are the power users, but also number two, whose ears are on them? Executive, okay? So this is sort of like a little side note. So they're really, since you brought up calendars for executive assistants, it's really, really important. For them, the experience is going to be a little different. We did have that with this one. I was in this one scenario, so I can speak to it, where they told me the executive system was having some problems, and it was with calendar, and it just behaved a little different than they had expected with Outlook. So the thing is they have all these different tabs up that are all the separate. You know, that was one of the things, calendars for each of the executives. There's this one assistant who managed 7 executives.
Oh, in Outlook?
No, in Google Apps.
Because
So
in Outlook, you'll say you could actually, as long as you just hook up Outlook into your Google Calendar, it'll bring all your other calendars in.
yeah, it did, but it was hard. It was like all of a sudden I have this little calendar that has all these different appointments. So we suggested that they actually bring them up in separate tabs. Little things like that can really make a difference. The other thing with calendar we found is, I'm digressing here, is it's more of what I call an operational thing. For example, in a lot of companies, they're used to adding attachments to their calendar event, and that has the agenda. So every time they want to change the agenda, they actually have to change the calendar event. And then that sends out emails to everyone telling them the calendar event changed. And we just showed them, why don't you create a shared doc instead and incorporate that in the event? And then your agenda is managed outside of the calendar event. So that might be another twist, is show how calendar can work really nicely with the collaborative stuff. Okay, I don't know if everyone followed that, but that can be extremely helpful. What?
If you modify the calendar event in terms of adding an agenda to it, you don't have to send an update out though.
Well, she was doing that.
But you could say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But every time in the actual, or in the calendar event itself, they typed in the description what the agenda was. And so therefore they had to hit save and it got sent out to everyone. It was just annoying. And we had suggested, why don't you try, this is a good example of where using a shared doc would be very helpful.
We're sick of
So-
receiving emails from you.
So are you still?
No, no.
Oh,
In that scenario, you tell the person sending them all out.
The calendar being.
Here, do this instead, because we're sick of receiving emails.
right, exactly. So you kind of want to highlight the strengths of our particular service. Okay. Okay, thank you. So we're going to end the presentation, and then we're going to talk about the exercise that I'm going to have everybody do.